So when we came up with this graphic on the title slide, we very much had as part of our vision that tools that we would create eventually would make its way to the public. I think we have a long way to get there as far as dealing with the overall intentional spread and amplification of disinformation, but that is definitely a part of our goal. So Mitre has been around for 65 years. We're a not-for-profit. We don't compete with industry. We've been doing social media analytics research for 14 years. There are two other projects I've listed here that have some similarities with our challenges in the disinformation space. Mitre acts as a trusted third party for the aviation industry, where we work across industry to share airline data to make the whole ecosystem safer. We also work in cybersecurity on the attack framework to help share threat information. And of course, what we see in cybersecurity and disinformation has a very tight coupling. In this case, the industry has decided not to compete on cyber threats and share information to make the overall industry safer. So whereas the first example is funded by the government, the second is more ground-up movement by industry. So please connect to me on LinkedIn. This shows our past work in looking at online and social media. For the last 18 months or so, we've been working primarily on disinformation. And most importantly, we've sort of started over because the challenge is so great that starting from a clean slate was necessary rather than basing it on technology we've been using for the last 14 years. So where did we start given the challenge is so large? We took a hard look at the terms of service for Twitter and Facebook and how people can perform on their platforms, how researchers can access the data, and we tried to understand the categories of harm and how they differ between these two social media platforms. This is a little out of date. We're trying to reread all the terms of service and update this picture, but a lot has happened in the last 18 months. I think standardizing this part of what's allowed and what's not allowed will go a long way to help us make progress. So if violations in the top 3 rectangles, which are the greenish yellow color, happen, accounts are removed, and the blue ones are when content is removed. So if we look at how these categories of harm sort of set the stage for how we're understanding the problem, information can be shared in these categories from different modalities: text, image, audio, and video, of course. And then each of the social media platforms have different lines of which allowed content is able to be kept on the platform and prohibitive content, which in theory they remove. These lines are extremely fuzzy and are all different for those categories of harm. I think I read recently in a news article that a contractor that was doing content management for one of the platforms decided to cancel the contract because it was so incredibly difficult to figure out what was allowable and what wasn't, as well as the difficulty for the employees to actually do that type of work. So the lines that you see are how the users game the system to keep their content online. The blue one is meant to show that a user goes right up against the line, and you can see they study where that line is and they make their content as close to it as possible. This chart is largely notional. Each of the lines for the social media platforms are just notionally drawn there. So this is the problem. So we tried to figure out what could be done, and so far we've just put research funding into this, and like everyone else, I think we're looking for sources of funding to scale this up to national and hopefully global scales. But if we look at a definition of the disinformation challenge, there's genuine free speech, of course. There's intentional weaponized bot armies. Content that is put online can be divisive, criminal, or harmful. The social media companies are trying to target a subset of that, law enforcement a different subset in a number of cases, fact checkers yet another subset. So that red oval really changes depending on which organization is playing their role. So we could have started in many different areas, false news sites as we saw earlier today, flooding channels, but we decided to focus on the inauthentic accounts. When we thought about what's changed in the last 3 to 4 years, the amplification piece really stands out. So if we could deal with minimizing the intentional spread and amplification of disinformation, maybe we could really deal with the scale problem more. We're seeing laws passed in various countries that are to monitor all content, which of course is not something we can do because of the scale issue. So if we look at the right-hand red upside-down triangle, it's very easy to create a bot. You can purchase curated bots. A sock puppet is a person masquerading as somebody else, and you can have you're a human, so very human behavior, so it's very hard for the bot detectors to detect you. You can curate bots across social media content, and of course, as you go down in this triangle, it's very difficult to detect, almost impossible. And of course, in order to do this, it's much more expensive to do what you see at the bottom of the triangle too. So if we target the amplification towards the top, we will push the adversaries down the triangle. So the problem will still exist, but we believe it would be still helpful if we could do that as a first step. So detecting influence operations across social media platforms was the goal, and I'm going to show you an example of that work. Standards are necessary, sharing threat information earlier, figuring out how to fund this activity over time is important, and then the ability to be able to respond is sort of on the right-hand side. So I'm going to go through an example. We focused on the European parliamentary elections. We follow all terms of service and accessing data. It's very difficult, as many of you know. We take a very large pool of data. We're not driven by any topic-based search. So as I understand, the fact-checking community, the targeted of what's fact-checked is fairly narrow. Our approach is very broad. I do believe there is a role for how to come up with a subset of data that can be fact-checked using this big data approach. So I think there's some very interesting ways that the communities can interact once these capabilities begin to exist. So we let the data drive where we see the disinformation coming. We use Crimson Hexagon, as we heard yesterday as well. We use it to create a clean data set. This is one of their visualizations where we're able to look at Reddit, Facebook, and YouTube and understand if the data we mean to collect is actually there. So because of the difficulty in creating search strategies, we worked mainly in English and Spanish for this use case. So taking the perspective of pulling in all data related to the European parliamentary elections, this was the output. So about 1.2 million social media posts. We had an equivalent number of news articles, which we just hid from this data set. It's very difficult to look at news and social media together, so that would be a next step. We then tried to drill into topic areas that might be of interest, and we tried to focus on topics that we weren't seeing being published. So migration topics brought us down to 60,000 posts. Migration and anti-feminist, about 10,000 posts. And then we released the filter on migration and just looked at anti-feminist, which was about 25,000 posts. You can see the breakdown in the pie chart itself. So as far as the community goes, this data is not humongous. This is a reasonable amount of data to share across a set of organizations who need to understand what's happening. So this gives me hope anyway, that if we can name organizations that can share data, which today doesn't exist, we can begin to save a lot of money by collecting it jointly. So essentially at this point, we start over again. We let the data drive the topics of interest. And the whole reason we need to do this is we don't follow groups and people. That's part of the rules. So we have to let the data drive where the suspicious behavior is coming from. Now, if we work with the social media platforms in the future and could go beyond the current terms of service or rules, it might make sense to take a different approach. But what is really heartening is that we can follow the rules and still find the suspicious accounts. Okay, so far I've talked just about using a tool that you can buy today. So the next step is, what is needed that you can't currently purchase that would be helpful for the disinformation challenge? So Crimson Hexagon provides all the data sources that you see in the gray. We sent the textual-based data sources through a hate detection algorithm. Many of these exist. You can plug and play the various ones in the various languages. We used Mitre, which is a University of Indiana tool to do bot detection for Twitter. We used Rest Sleep Comment, which is an open source Reddit bot detector. And we have about 40 criteria of what makes a post suspicious, everything about the post, the user, the timing, and so on, and we're beginning to make an Instagram bot detector. I wanted to highlight why we focus on bots also. That you can't follow groups and people, but if it's a computer program, you can get much closer to that line. So by filtering for what we think is bot compared to human, it allows us to do more analysis if we think it's a bot. So again, it's driven by the rules. We pull the data into our Amazon Web Service cloud, and we're able to do some analytics there. This basically shows all the sources. We then segment into the anti-feminist use case, and the bottom left is the hate detection, and the top right is the Twitter bot detection, and the bottom right is the Reddit bot detection. This is for an analyst, a user, to understand the data, to see what it's telling them. So it's not a decision maker dashboard yet, and we're very far from a public dashboard. So, okay, so this is the results of the bot detection. So for the anti-feminist use case, we passed about 7,000 tweets, which you see on the right-hand side, and about 879 were tagged as bots. Our algorithm coefficient is fairly loose as far as we don't make it a very stringent, whether it thinks it's a bot or not, because there's a lot of behavior that's very close to the line, which we want to actually see some of that. I think these bot detectors do have a lot of noise, and so getting a little bit more tagged items so a human can then look at it has been our approach so far. And so far, of these, 40 accounts have been removed or taken down by the users themselves from Twitter. So this is not a true validation, it's just the best we have. And then on the Reddit side, we are also beginning to track the same type of data we're doing on the Twitter side. So this gives the analyst the ability to say, the algorithm thinks these accounts are suspicious, now the human can look at them. So what the analyst is trying to weigh is whether they think it's a bot or a human, and then how many of the 40 or so criteria that I mentioned earlier are attributed to as why the human would make that decision, the analyst would make that decision. And I wanted to just show one illustrative example of how hard this is to do. So I asked my analyst to sort of create me a chart of what she does to try to create the reasons of why she thinks an account is suspicious, and they're captured in the rectangle in the top right. So divisive content, inflammatory language, and links to suspicious blogs. And of course, this is time consuming. Okay, so we worked for about 4 months on this use case. We used all the technology that I discussed, and then we spent a lot of time trying to answer the so what. And the so what in our case was, can we show cross-social media platform amplification across platforms, countries, and languages? And so that's the result of this chart. So the idea is to use technology to help automate this more, but this takes a lot of human labor today. The left side is the Spanish language work. The right-hand side is the English. 2 of the emerged topics are there, so gender-based violence and women's and men's rights. The bot detector, which you see in the middle, is the botometer, so the Twitter accounts between the 2 sides. And then we also have the bot detection for Reddit, which is across the top. So the red pill narrative that you see there. Sometimes the connections between the items that are close together, such as the scientific feminism Twitter, see that? And the blog posts are actually the same user. Sometimes they're retweeting each other, and sometimes they're just talking about the same thing. So it's not a perfect visualization, but it tries to get at everything on this chart is suspicious, and a number of them have been detected by the bot detectors themselves with the analyst work on top of it. Now, what gives me the most hope about this result is what's shown in the top right green rectangle, is that this bot network is posting on a number of other topics. So as we're able to tag bot networks in a way that can be shared with other organizations, the labor of one human analyst can benefit the other analysts working on those other topics. And I think we heard a similar result yesterday. That there's 10 narratives per country, or there's a finite number of networks interacting, so that funding to build this type of capability and organizations to collaborate together would help us. And just to make sure I'm being clear, I see this as a tool for fact checkers. So it's another tool that would say, there's manipulation happening on this topic, and look at the evidence of the suspicious behavior. Okay, so once we understand amplification, we think that getting into the content is the appropriate time. So we looked at hate speech towards politicians. All this hate speech is towards female politicians except for what's shown in orange. That was towards male politicians, and the language was quite similar. So we were able to show across country as well. So the hate detection tool picked up the hung, drawn, and quartered comment that was directed towards Theresa May in the YouTube comment. So that's what led us into creating this whole chart. Okay, I'm going to go a little faster so I don't run out of time. I want to make sure to get to what can we do about it. So I'm going to skip over the vaccine work, and hopefully I can come back to it. If not, please talk to me after. But I would hate to not address what we can do about it. So the idea of working as part of a group, an alliance, whatever the correct word is, to work on common data sets, purchase data together, work with the platforms and the governments to go beyond terms of service, share threat information earlier, alert the platforms. I think what they're really interested in is what's coming my way from other platforms, so there's an incentive there as well. Working on standards to share information, get beyond each organization publishing results, really begin to connect on the data. And lastly, but very importantly, how can we help the public educate themselves more by providing these tools to them as well? We see this as a software tool in the cloud with different enclaves where different access to those enclaves exists. So the researchers would have one enclave, perhaps the fact checkers another, law enforcement, and others, the appropriate ones. Obviously, this is difficult, but I believe what's needed. We've brainstormed a little of what costs would be needed, data, architecture, collaboration. We'd have to be very careful about access, possible funding sources, charitable organizations, member fees, national governments, social media platforms. We've seen work started, and I mentioned this yesterday, on sharing threat information. So the MISInfosec group, which is from the Credibility Coalition, has had at least 2 meetings now, and others are thinking about the challenge, such as Schneier on the right, Bruce Schneier. So this is really important. There isn't funding for this today, but there's a bunch of folks working together to make this happen. This is Bruce Schneier's work about an attack chain, trying to understand the various patterns, so it's the same topic that we were discussing yesterday, and then making those patterns available to researchers and fact checkers so they can understand what's in the data. It's very hard and labor intensive to piece this together, so sharing at the pattern level is very important. And keeping it up to date. So even if you look at all the old patterns, new ones are emerging all the time. So the Credibility Coalition has used historical attacks. They're using the Sticks and Taxi framework. Taxi is like an API, a way to share. And the what information to share is the Sticks framework. It comes from cybersecurity. It has been augmented for disinformation. So the goal is to standardize the pattern language. And this will allow us to test the various attack chains that people think are happening. And this has to be automated to be updated in near real time, so we stay up to date with the threat. We've been asked to think hard about potential regulation. We've put forward a vision on users trusting that they're communicating with real people. So the idea to tag, if there's indication that there's a bot on a platform, can it be tagged? It's very easy to go on these platforms today and find the bots very easily. So I think a requirement of tagging is important, or removal. Social media platforms working with research to have better access to data. And of course, some of that is starting, but it's usually one organization to one organization, not as part of a group. And then government agencies and nonprofits helping to monitor the health of the overall ecosystem. We've tried to categorize regulations into a number of categories, especially based on the technical challenges of the problem. So making sure that if a regulation is created, it's a scalable solution that can be brought to bear. So services focused on identity of users, privacy services focused on privacy, how to share data, as I was just highlighting that MisInfoSec group is doing, reporting requirements and standardization of categories of harm, creation of organizations to work on the challenges, who funds and how that funding occurs, and then how to oversee progress. We believe that amplification should be the focus because we can't see any other way to create a scalable solution. All right, and I have 5 minutes left, so let me see if there are questions.
Thank you, very interesting. I was just wondering, like, because of these platforms, it's obvious that it's needed to pull up these things, and just in preparation of the European elections, there was kind of a different kinds of platforms coming. Do you have some sort of a common arena between the experts and the technical experts as well to kind of expose and see that how could it be joined, or is it like a survival of the fittest and everybody's lobbying their own case? For example, do you work with the first draft, for example, or this type of things? And do you know about the European efforts, like it's called the SOMA project and
Yes.
this type of things?
Yep, I've heard of SOMA and First Draft. Based on 4 or 5 conferences we've been to in the last 6 months, there seems to be consensus around what's needed, and funding is the challenge. So that we feel very confident now that there's enough will that a solution like this would really help. But it's very difficult politically in a number of climates to get government funding, and also problematic. And then the social media platforms have equal challenges, I think. Have you seen any different?
I was just wondering, like, now there's a lot of, actually in this field, a lot of pressure put in the EU level as well, because being kind of free of certain things, but I don't know what is coming, but it's good to have a one voice of the, let's say, the people who are able to come up with this type of let's say solutions and make it heard there, because they are thinking about it. There's even a tender going on at the moment on this type of things, but this needs the kind of real experts to come together.
Right. We've estimated that, 2 million to sort of do a scale of the U.S. Presidential election would be, a year, would be like a good starting point, with maybe a price point of 5 million once it's ramped up, which doesn't sound like a ton of money, but politically speaking, it's very challenging to find right now.